Hi everybody, it's Sally here. Today I'm going to do a quite quick little video showing you how you can cast on and off using your main machine Carriage. So I think when most people buy a knitting machine for the first time, they are possibly somewhat surprised to discover that the instruction books don't tell you how to cast on or off using your Carriage. You're often given lots of fairly strange and sometimes difficult to master methods of casting on and obviously casting off. And I think some people go through their machine knitting existence blissfully unaware that you can actually use your main Carriage to cast on and off. I have to say that neither method is particularly quick, particularly the cast on. I don't actually think it's any quicker than doing it by hand, which is probably why it's ignored a lot of the time. Although the cast off one I think is a little bit speedier, and certainly I don't think it's any slower than casting off using transfer tool. And particularly I use it the cast off method more than I do the cast on method, because I can't get my blinking linker to work, my cast off linker, not my sewing up linker. And so I do use it sometimes. Let's start off with the cast on first of all. It's a method of e-wrapping on your Carriage, on your needle bed using the main Carriage rather than wrapping it by hand. And as I say, I don't actually think it's particularly quicker, possibly even a bit slower than doing it by hand, but that's easy for me to say because I've been doing hand e-wrap cast on for donkey's years and I've got the muscle memory to do it. Although as I get older and I get more arthritic-y, and particularly when I had carpal tunnel syndrome badly before my operations and I couldn't feel in my fingertips terribly well, I find that these, particularly on the standard gauge machine as well, where the needles are closer together, that some of these more manual operations could get a little bit tricky. So I'm just going to do it with a wee bit of waste yarn. And I need a clothes peg. So to begin with, I'm just going to get my yarn and wrap it around my clothes peg to weight it so that I can stick it through my yarn feeder and just leave it dangling there. So I've threaded up my Carriage with my yarn. This being a UK 4-ply, for me my main tension would normally be at 7 on the dial here, and you can choose to leave it at main tension, which will make a looser cast on edge, but if you want a slightly firmer one you can turn it down 1 or possibly even 2 whole numbers to get a tighter edge. I'm going to turn it down 1 just for now. You want your rustle levers at 2, so back, and the side levers forwards. Nothing. Make sure you've got nothing in your punch card reader and it's locked off. And that's all you have to do in terms of setting up the Carriage. You don't want the weaving brushes down, they need to be up. And then you're just going to set the Carriage to slip and start at the edge furthest away from you. You can do this from either side. So I'm going to start from the right, as I'm right-handed, that's where I normally start. And so I'll just pull one needle out to work and go right, from right to left and then back again. And that has just put, move this, I'll do that again because it was not caught by the camera. Yarn is threaded through. I just put one needle out to D position. It needs to come right out, not B, because your Carriage on slip and it's got to catch this. And just go from to left and back to right again. And that has put a wrap stitch around that needle. Leave that needle where it is and bring out the one between the Carriage and it to D, and just repeat that for as many as you need. Oops, this yarn is just a bit of old waste yarn that I rewound. So you need to make sure that your overhead tension is good. It doesn't want to be too tight or too loose. And you just repeat that all the way across. As I say, I don't think it's quicker than doing it by hand, but if you find it fiddly, it is possibly requires less manual dexterity than winding it by hand. I think possibly the biggest advantage of doing it with the carriage like this is that you're going to get very even tension across these wraps as it does it. One of the problems beginners tend to have is that they wrap these too tight, and then when it comes to knitting them back with the carriage, they find they can't get, particularly if you've got 100+ needles wrapped up, you can't get the carriage to go back across. Because they've wrapped it too tight. So there we go. I've just done 20 there. Now you can either pull all those out to D, just by putting your finger against the stitch and pushing the needles forward, or you can hold them in place with the length of ravel cord, which you do by putting the ravel cord between the sinker posts and the needles. It isn't in the needle hooks. I'll just tip that forwards so you can see it a bit better as to where that ravel cord is located. It's not in the needle hooks. It's sitting in the space between the sinker posts and the needle hooks. If you put it in the needle hooks, it'll just get tangled up in there and you won't be able to pull it out afterwards. So just put you to rights. So hold those ends down. Oops. And set your carriage to knit stockinette and then knit across. There we go. Knit about 4 rows, pull the cord out, knit a few more rows, and then you should have enough knitting on there now to add weights. Now I forgot to turn my tension back up to main tension when I changed the stockinette, so I've changed that up to 7 now. And you can carry on knitting. And let's just have a little look at the cast on edge. If you can, oops. I can take this peg off the end now if it's flapping about and annoying me. And there is the E-wrap cast on edge. As I say, this is a bit of crappy old yarn that I rewound from my waist knitting. That's why it's got knots in it and it's made holes. So, but hopefully your proper yarn wouldn't do things like that. Anyway, let's put the weights back on, and now we'll come to showing you the main carriage cast off. Now I leave it on main tension, and I want my single-ended transfer tool. And all I need to do is to set the carriage to slip. So I've just moved the dial round from stockinette to slip, which is the first one off to the left. I'm afraid this obviously only applies to silver reed machines. Those of you that have brothers, maybe June or Nigel might like to, or someone else who's experienced with a brother might like to weigh in as to what your carriage settings might be. But you could do either of these methods on any of the silver reed machines. Doesn't matter what gauge it is. And so to cast off, all you're going to do is to move this again, get you a little bit closer. And you can do this in both directions this time. So you take the first stitch off, transfer it to its neighbour, and again you can do it in front or behind the sinker post, entirely your preference. I do it behind so that it stays suspended and it gives a nice, neat, even edge, and just move the carriage across. And on this one, the cast off, you can do this in both directions. So take the next stitch off, put it onto its neighbour, move back. But each time, the stitch that you're transferring over, so that you've got two stitches on the one needle there, you pull that out to D. and it will knit back with the carriage on slip. You might want to get your little half a credit card and flip those latches open, although as you're passing the carriage each time, the magnets will pull them back up again. But as you can see, the cast off with the carriage is reasonably speedy. I don't think it's any slower than doing the whole thing by hand. And certainly once you get into a rhythm of it, it goes quite quick. And in both cases, your active needle, you set your carriage to slip and just pull your active needle, the one that you want to knit or wrap, out to D, and the carriage will take care of it for you. Oops, pulled that one a bit loose. Tweaking down. And when you get to the last one, just break the yarn off. And then you can do one more wrap through the loop and pull it through. And that's casting off using the main carriage. Let's have a little look-see. Stop putting my tools in my mouth when I'm about to speak. So the top one is the cast off. That's the cast off edge. Nice neat edge. Doesn't really look any different to doing it by hand, but if you want to use the carriage, there you go. And this one at the bottom is the cast on edge, the E-wrap. That was at tension 6 instead of 7, and I did the first few rows of knitting at 6 because I've got to turn it up, so make sure you don't make the same mistake. And there's an E-wrap cast on, closed cast on. I hope you find those 2 hints useful. I first saw the carriage cast on, I think it was posted in an American knitting group, and it was shared online a number of months ago, maybe 18 months, 2 years ago, and they did it on a plastic mid-gauge machine, and I thought I must have a look, and I'm sure just by setting the carriage to slip, because I already knew about the cast off, that you'd be able to do the same on the metal beds, and certainly you can. But I can't claim to have invented this by any stretch of the imagination. It's been around for donkey's years. So, but you might like to experiment with it and see if you prefer it to doing it all by hand. Thank you.